Please welcome First Draft's U.S. Director, Dr. Claire Wardle.
Hello, we got to the end. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in over the past 3 days. This is our final session, and I hope, as the music intimated, this is going to be a little bit more low-key and I hope a little bit more fun, even though maybe some of the topics won't be so much. But my hope is that this can actually just be a conversation with one of my favorite people from the news industry, who I'll introduce in a second. But hello to some of you are on Zoom and some of you on the live stream. So hello to anybody who is watching from wherever you are, whether it's in pajamas or in a suit. Who wears a suit these days? Infotheque has been quite the ride. We have learned so much about doing a virtual event, particularly when you kick it off during a tornado/hurricane that hits the East Coast at the same time. But we made it through. And I hate to ask this, but as you probably all know, it's really important to evaluate what's working and what works less well, particularly when you're trying new things. And also those of you who work for any kind of organization that are funded, you will know that it's very important to explain whether something has worked or not. So I would be really grateful if you could scan the QR code and fill in the survey. That would make me really happy. And we're doing it up top, so you can do it as we kind of get into the ride here. But I wanted to introduce Stacy-Marie Ishmael, who is really such a powerhouse. And I first met, I think, 5 years ago when I was at the Tau Center for Digital Journalism. And at that time, she was working at BuzzFeed and she was the mobile editor. And I remember seeing her talk on a panel about mobile and why we needed to take mobile seriously. And again, what a reminder of how far we've come in 5 years. She's also amazing because not only is she having a great backdrop, but she's specifically wearing a shirt with little British flags on, which I think she may have done for me. So if you don't know Stacy-Marie, she is the editorial director of the Texas Tribune, but she has spent her career at the intersection of media and technology. She has previously worked at places like the Financial Times, as I mentioned, at BuzzFeed. She was a JSK fellow out at Stanford. She then was a senior editor at Apple. And then very recently, at the end of, this was actually announced right at the end of February, Stacy-Marie got the job as editorial director at Texas Tribune. And we all clapped and we were so excited that she was heading to Austin. And then COVID hit. And then, well, the rest is history. So I'm going to get into that with Stacy-Marie. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, but I would love to have time at the end for you to ask questions. So if you're on Zoom, please add your questions in the Q&A box. If you're on the live stream, please tweet at First Draft News, and I will get those through magic back channels. So Stacy-Marie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure you're as busy as all of us, and this is probably your 17th Zoom of the day.
Yes.
So I'm really grateful. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what did it feel like to land in Austin just as it felt like the world was falling apart? Like professionally, how on earth did you handle that?
I suppose when you're moving, which is already one of like the top 3 worst experiences that you can go through, that, you know, that buffeted me from the reality of just what was about to happen. I mean, I remember right before I landed, I tweeted like, hey, anybody got great recommendations for, you know, tacos and a bike shop? And I got this whole list and I, you know, very diligently put that into my to-do list and I was all prepared. And then I had one breakfast taco and then everything went to shelter in place. And I was like, sign from the universe. So this is what happens every time I come back to news. But I still think that in March, when all of this was happening, and even in April, there was a sense of optimism almost, and a camaraderie around, okay, this is something we have to get through. Other countries have been through this, like we'll rally, and now it's August and the rally is flagging. You know, I think it's really very hard, and it's especially hard for people who are professionally responsible for telling or helping audiences understand just why it is so hard. Like there is no critical distance between me wanting to do a thing and not being able to do that thing and knowing exactly why, like the chain of steps that led to that thing not being possible in this city, in this state, in this country, whereas, you know, various other folks that we're all friends with, lots of different people around the world, are able to enjoy those activities. And I think that people in media we're usually sheltered in a slightly different way from the things we're reporting on. Like even when we're in the field, even when we're dealing with traumatic experiences, you can still sort of remove yourself physically from the reality of that thing, even if mentally and emotionally you can't, in a way that has been impossible during the pandemic, because we are hit in the same way as everyone else is.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think we have not done enough to explain when people's worlds have been turned upside down, we're in this fight or flight mode. So actually, when we see people believing in conspiracies, when we see misinformation, of course, this is what we do. But I think we're failing to explain that our brains are just almost incapable of being critical right now. And that everything we thought we knew about this is completely different. But I agree, as a journalist, how do you separate the personal from professional?
I don't know if one can at this moment, but for me, that has been very helpful. In an interesting twist, you know, one of the other great crises of our time is like the reckoning with the reality of racial injustice in the United States and around the world, right? And I think that's another story that many of my colleagues at the Tribune and other places have not viscerally experienced themselves. But more and more, as there are more protests, right, as there are more incidents reported of police violence and police brutality, as it becomes an increasing part of political stump speeches and campaigns, people who have historically been inured to those things are suddenly like, oh, I didn't know that this was what was happening. And I don't know if we've quite reckoned with the emotional reality and what this is doing to the people who are experiencing these things, and to your point, like what it's doing to our ability to process all of this at the same time with a critical eye, or from a critical distance, when you have upheaval in every possible category. You have labor market upheaval, you have record, in some places, unemployment, you have societal and cultural upheaval, you are in the midst of you're very close to an election period where you're being bombarded with all kinds of different messages. You are spending more time in work mode because you no longer have a commute. You're not like going to the gym in the middle of the day. You're not going for a walk. It's just like you in an information saturation posture, for like 19 hours a day. And most of that information is deeply, deeply negative and or at least emotionally challenging to reckon with. And there is something jarring to me about our industry still trying to present the news, as it were, as if it were possible to separate from that context, right? Like people are reading things in an emotional state that we are also in while creating those things, but it's almost like, well, the news at 4, like with the same register and tone and presentation. And I think that's a problem, and it's doing folks a disservice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, just very quickly, like, how are you managing your staff in this environment? I mean, staff that you haven't really spent any time with. You haven't like been to the bar after work. You haven't like had birthday party. Like, how are you? Because I mean, exactly to your point, even let's just go down for a second to like how you manage and protect staff, and how do you think about hours worked? How do you make sure that people's mental health is okay? I mean, all of those things. How are you doing that when you haven't even really spent time with your team?
In March, when we were all happier people, there was a notion of, well, it's just, we just have to adjust to working from home. And I remember thinking, like, there's a difference between working from home and distributed reporting and like surviving a pandemic. And I know a lot about distributed teams. Almost all of the teams I've ever run or been a part of have been across countries, time zones, geographies. This is not that thing, right? Because we are working through a mental health crisis that's affecting like entire populations at the same time. We are working through the loss of caretakers. We are working through uncertainty around your own exposure to a still incurable disease, as it were. And so a lot of the conversations that I've been having with that team started with, okay, here's the plan, here's the coverage line. And then very quickly evolved into, and here's how we're going to make sure that we are mostly able to do that. And one of the things, and this was controversial when I suggested it, I was like, I'm going to make everyone take at least 10 days off between June and the end of August. And as editors want to do, it was like, they freaked out. They were like, there's no way. Who can be away for that long? How are we going to do this? What's the coverage plan? But it was the kind of thing where if we don't, as newsroom leaders, make sure that our teams are doing what they can in this limited and prescribed world that we can to cope in whatever ways are possible, like we actually can't do our jobs, right? Because our jobs require us to be able to relatively dispassionately deal with an unrelentingly grim set of facts and figures and present those in ways that feel accurate and fair. And if you are furious or depressed or sad or scared or about to murder your children, it's just like it's hard to to show up at work. And I think that among my other feelings about the invasion of work into people's personal spaces is we have to be aware that we've always asked people who work in news to go above and beyond. And that means we have a responsibility as employers of people in news to go above and beyond for them in a crisis too.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think as there's this recognition that this isn't ending anytime soon, I feel like, right now, I think many of us are mourning a life that we have lost and we're going through that process. And then to me, it's like, well, how do we recognize that it's new and what would that new environment look like? And so my team are probably going to fall off their chairs. But to me, it's like, do we do a 4-day week? Like,
right.
How do we say
how do you do it?
So many hours now because nobody's commuting and we're all just grabbing stuff and still scrolling late into the night. Like, how do we recognize that and say, okay, 40 hours, you're probably just gonna have to do 4 days. Like, I think we have to think differently because there's no way that we can keep running at this speed.
I mean, I'm trying to bring lunchtime back because I keep being in this mode where I'll be on a call from 7 a.m. and then at 4 p.m. like, oh, I'm really hungry.
Yeah.
What happened to eating?
No, I know. And somebody yesterday used the term bio break.
Oh, God. I've heard that. It's a very specific Americanism that I do not enjoy.
Which either means putting a sandwich in your face or like nipping to the loo. And it's like, we should actually, like I said, I'm with you about how do we bring back those times.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just get a little bit to the kind of news situation. You are in Texas.
I am in Texas.
Many of us, of course, it's a big state and lots of people are covering Texas. But as somebody who's living in Texas, can you talk to us about what's going on both around COVID and the election?
Sure. So much. And I'm just going to do a casual plug. I do invite everyone to check out the Texas Tribune's website. But I think one of the most interesting things for me, and I want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Millie Tran, who is our Chief Product Officer, is we talk a lot about how other people, other media organizations, particularly national media organizations, are covering like the Texas story. And one of the tallies we have is like how many New York Times reporters are in the state at any moment. And, there is this feeling right now in Texas, which if you've ever lived in California or been around Californians, like that, whenever the Times shows up, you're like, what's going on now? Like, why are y'all here? And it to me is a barometer of two things. One, people are very interested in understanding the political story, right? And that's the lens through which a lot of this is being told. There's a question, and we see this in the search inquiries coming to our website, like, will Texas go blue? Or, there's a lot of attention paid to polls right now, various of them, including one that we ran earlier this year, are showing either Biden ahead of Trump in some of the polling, depending on the polls that you look at, or Trump ahead of Biden, but within the margin of error, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty around like, what does this mean, not just for the national election, but kind of statewide politics, right? Like, what does it mean if there's sort of a resurgent Democratic field in a state like Texas? And that is, I think, an incredibly interesting and important story, and it's certainly not the only one. I think one of the other stories that we've really been paying attention to is kind of, the rise of the governor. And we saw this, and again in April, when we were all different people, there was a lot of, people were looking at what's Newsom going to do, what's Cuomo doing, what's happening with DeSantis. And, and then Greg Abbott is also a significant part of that national conversation. People are looking to how are different governors, particularly in either red or blue states or states that may be purple, responding to coronavirus. And, one of the big things to me that's been very interesting in Texas is the attempts by different politicians to actively politicize certain parts of the coronavirus, like wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. You know, one of our reporters, Alex Samuels, did a great piece on the politicization of mask wearing. She also wrote a story about how people in Austin think they are way more capital W woke than they actually are from like a historical perspective. But I think there's also a fascinating to me, particularly as someone who, you know, is relatively newer to Texas, of understanding all of the different institutions that make a state work, right? So of course you have the governor's office, of course you have the legislature, but there's also the agency responsible for providing unemployment relief. There's also the network of bodies that, you know, collectively tell schools, hey, this is what you should be doing. This is how you should be thinking about this. There's the fact that different cities and municipalities have kind of their own, you know, Mayor Steve Adler here in Austin, or, you know, other folks in different parts of the states who may or may not agree with having a mask mandate, not having a mask mandate. We want to have local enforcement. And Texas, more than anywhere else I've lived, has been super interesting for me on that like more local political level, and really helped me understand and appreciate how important it is that as an organization like the Texas Tribune, which does have this statewide mandates, we can elevate those stories and tell them in a way that's not only the headline of, you know, this is how Biden is polling, this is what like Trump is saying about Texas. It's more like, this is what's happening in Houston and Dallas, and this is why those things matter, and this is why those things may be a bellwether for what's happening in other places.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask a follow-up question, which is, and you've kind of you know, alluded to this, but what's your pet peeve about national journalists who come to tell a local story?
Not attributing, which is not my favorite thing. The Tribune is wonderful for lots of reasons, obviously, but specifically in this case, we make all of our journalism republishable by pretty much anyone who, you know, kind of follows our guidelines, and freely so, and very accessible, right? Like one of our primary driving things is we want to make it so that folks who don't have X number of reporters in kind of the state capital can still provide information to their audiences that helps them be like more informed Texans. And so our model allows us to do that. Our business model, our funding mechanism allows us to do that. But I'm always struck, and I have been for a long time, at when national media organizations, you know, to use a phrase from Heather Chaplin, like parachute in and retrace the steps that were, you know, previously made like a day before by a reporter at the Morning News or the Statesman. And there's not even like a wink in the direction of where that came from. And it's so interesting to me because you don't lose anything when you do that. I mean, it's almost like we're still relitigating the wars of should you link or should you not, and is blogging journalism. Yeah. And we've like, we just
you made us want to feel like we were at an actual journalism conference.
I just had to like just drop that in there. But it's so easy, and I think it helps credibility in all kinds of different ways. It helps in a technical perspective. It helps those media organizations be ranked better in Google, which is like meaningful for when people are looking for information. But it also, I think, shows that those reporters have done the work, because I consider knowing the prior art to be like a key part of your sourcing, right? And I'm not saying that like people arrive at ideas independently all the time, but when you suddenly see 3 or 4 different stories in different media organizations about a single hospital in a rural county that only one local newspaper had reported on previously, you know, there's a bit of an eyebrow quirk about why none of those gave any acknowledgement whatsoever to how they found the story in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. And the fact that it's 2020 and we're still doing it is insane to me. But and actually, you just made me think, maybe not everybody knows the funding model for the Texas Tribune, but can you maybe explain that and then say, how is it different as somebody who has worked in, you know, like Financial Times, which has its own very interesting, very early to the membership model, BuzzFeed, obviously very early to the kind of digital startup, VC money. Yeah, what does it mean on a daily basis to work in a nonprofit newsroom?
It's fun. So one of the things I respect about our funding model is we're incredibly transparent about it. So we have a section of our website dedicated to, you know, everyone who's given us money kind of at the personal level and the institutional level. Like many nonprofit organizations, we have a range of institutional donors, right? We have been supported by the Ford Foundation, we have been supported by Knight, We have a very active membership program. I like to say that we were like very early to the membership game. That, you know, is also a meaningful part of our contributions, and those folks are, you know, smaller dollar all the way up to the thousands. And then we have corporate well, not exactly advertising, more like content marketing and brand advertising. So you will see a post or sort of an ad unit that said sponsored post brought to you by kind of thing, and no programmatic, right? I mean, like there may be like a tiny slice which is mostly whitelisted as opposed to blacklisted. And that's been really helpful because, you know, we're not using Taboola, we're not using Outbrain. We have a lot more control over our inventory. We have a lot more understanding of, these are relationship driven, you know, media partnerships, as opposed to we're treating our audience like inventory. And I think that's really important.
So it's not going to surprise you, because this is a first draft event, that I wanted to turn a little bit to misinformation. We've had a couple of great panels today. We have 5 local news fellows from Wisconsin, you know, Ohio and Colorado and Florida, Michigan. And to hear them talk about local misinformation, it's a reminder that at the national disinformation beat level, it's a lot of Russians under the bed. It's a lot of, you know, state-sponsored stuff. And then locally, it doesn't always look the same. So are you seeing much of that in Texas?
Very unfortunately, yes. And it's targeted in the areas that you would not be surprised by. You know, it's around the census. It's a lot of it's a lot of medical misinformation. It's a lot of sort of targeted voter things that look very much like voter suppression, you know, suggestions about, oh, if you didn't register by X date, it doesn't matter if it, like the early voting period is still open, you don't qualify. It's like very subtle. And I can often tell what's trending because people will start to email us and say, you know, why aren't you reporting that? Which is often a gigantic red flag that, you know, somebody is trying to be nefarious over on some corner of WhatsApp. And I think one of the things that we have really tried to do is focus on providing useful, actual, accurate information to fill some of that, you know, vacuum that otherwise exists. And it's challenging because we are not as large as various of, you know, the national peers. And it's particularly challenging, and this is, I think, an area of opportunity for a lot of local media organizations, because we're really only doing it in English.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we do know is there is a tremendous amount of misinformation and disinformation targeted at Spanish language households and communities, of which there are more than a small number in Texas. And so that's something that I'm always thinking about, you know, like it's fantastic and extremely rewarding that we can get our English language journalism out to as many organizations as we currently do. Are there other things that we can be doing to do that? So one of our partnerships, we have a really innovative program called, it's a joint program with ProPublica, so it's the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, Texas Tribune. It's a reporting partnership with an investigative focus, and ProPublica gets their stories on a discretionary basis translated into Spanish. And you know, we've really been looking at that as a model and as an opportunity, because we know that we are doing such, I'm highly biased, obviously, but we are doing such good work on, you know, reporting on the census, reporting on elections, reporting on coronavirus, that we're always trying to figure out how do we get that meaningful, useful, fact check information to more households than we currently do.
Yeah, and I would say absolutely, it's 2020, and I think what we, and I say we, is those of us who are thinking about misinformation just completely failed to recognize we weren't monitoring properly in different languages, and we didn't have the relationships with different communities. And the difficulty, which you also know, is there might be something trending amongst WhatsApp groups in a particular Spanish language community in a part of Texas. Is it right that you blast it on your front page and hit everybody when actually it should require a kind of a more targeted response? And I think the challenge from the media perspective is, it's broadcast or not, and like, and is it a role for a journalism organization to connect with certain gatekeepers from certain community groups? But I would say, in the same way as we've potentially improved relationships between national and local newsrooms, but not that much, but a tiny bit better, how are we then connecting with community level community newsrooms in a way that I don't think it's on the radar? And I mean, this won't surprise you, but I remember very clearly when there was the London riots in 2011, and the BBC was there with its helicopters, and they were like covering where the different, riots were and fires. And afterwards, everybody was writing their long pieces about why did this happen. And all the local community radio stations from London were like, we could have told you why it happened. You just never listened to us. Yep. And that was like 10 years ago. And I see it again, that we're just not connected in a way that there's no way that many newsrooms that are starting tip lines, like send us out your misinformation. Well, they're not trusted necessarily.
It's not only the tip lines, it's just like, it's the information that we ask for, right? Which I worry about this all the time. It's like, we are having protests. We have photographers in the field who are taking pictures of protesters. We've given ours guidance on how to do that in a way that does not potentially endanger anyone without kind of compromising the news value. We also, like many organizations, do call outs. So we'll say things like, hey, send us your questions, send us tips. Yes, we have a secure tip line. And so it's not only about the trust on the front end, it's like, how do we ensure that information is secure on the back end when you have, as we've seen in Seattle, people trying to claim that information gathered by reporters in the process of reporting can be used in police investigations, right? And so I really worry about, one, we have a trust deficit with a lot of these communities anyway, and are we taking seriously the possibility that we might inadvertently worsen that if our own news gathering, investigative reporting, processes don't take appropriate steps to like keep that information safe?
Yeah, I totally agree. And to that subject, I mean, obviously, as you said, we started off in March dealing with COVID. And I think famously, middle of June, we were just like, oh, like, how are we going to carry on covering this? And of course, then there was the footage emerged of George Floyd's murder. And then, of course, not everything changed, but all of a sudden, we suddenly recognized that we were fighting this. And so I'm sure you were part of many conversations internally at the Texas Tribune. We certainly were. And I think we know that in almost every newsroom, there were the conversations about, A, we're nowhere near as representative as we should be. And secondly, how should newsrooms be approaching structural racism? And is objectivity in any way a model for this? And I mean, I have many thoughts on this. I'd love to hear, and I don't think we're through this, but yeah. Have a chat.
Will we ever be? One, I think, so in our Texas Tribune mission, one of the words that we use is non-partisan. And we also talk about fairness. And I think that, one, I think this discussion has been largely weaponized, CC Harper signatories. And two, I think that it is operating at a level of gatekeeping that we are not self-aware about. Because really what a lot of this discussion comes down to is only certain types of people are allowed to have biases, right? Like if you are a white male home-owning of a certain class, of a certain educational tenure, or the school ties back in the UK where we have both spent a lot of time in media, that's totally fine, right? Like that really specific perspective on the world is accepted as default, and not even just default, but neutral. And anything that is either to the left or right of that is where people start to have questions about objectivity. And so the language that we use around objectivity has always had a lot of built-in assumptions about whose perspectives and whose perspectives on what are treated as neutral. I remember like the Sotomayor confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court, and there was just this question of like, can a Latina woman really be objective? And you're like, did you ask any of your colleagues this question? Like, was this a thing? And that is, for me, like one of the great sins of omission in newsrooms, where we talk about race in newsrooms as if it only affects Black people or it only affects brown people. And actually, when we need to talk about race in newsrooms in the way that we have like upheld whiteness as the implicit standard against which everyone else is measured, as opposed to an equal party in this conversation and equal part of the interrogation and the reckoning that we need to have.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, and I would love to carry on chatting about it. But I think, this phrase non-partisan, I think, and I'll even admit at first draft, we were kind of like, oh, well, in which case we shouldn't really make a statement because we're non-partisan. And then luckily, after a few days of being slapped around the face by my team, I realized that that was my BBC training kicking in.
Yeah.
Like utterly, I was like, I can't say anything because I'm going to get fired. And interestingly, I was on a BBC podcast about this issue, and this amazing BBC journalist of color basically was like, listen, in the UK, all we can talk about is statues because we can't actually get to grips with our own role in slavery, but we feel okay about statues. And he was like, it's just such a British thing that we just, and it was so fascinating in terms of that. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the land of the Windrush, crisis of exiling people who were born in or brought to the UK. And yeah, there's a lot. And I think every country internalizes their form of racism slightly differently. And the conversation in the US, I remember when I moved to the US, I used to make a sort of a gallows humor joke, which was, at least here people tell me when they're being racist. And in the UK, I always had to kind of figure it out. And, that, I think as a result of that, in your faceness, we have assumed that kind of talking about it more publicly means we've reckoned with it better. And I just don't think that's true.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, July, of course, June and July, lots and lots of conversations about it. And then I feel like here we are, August 6th. It's a PS question on how are we actually going to grapple with this? How are we actually going to put the funding behind this? How are we actually going to ensure that there's a pipeline of journalists there's a million questions. And I do slightly worry that because of where we are right now, it's like people, they don't know where to even start. And anyway.
I mean, you remember, I think this was a news guys that we were both at, and there was a session. It was one of those things like why are there not more brown and black people in newsrooms? And I was exasperated, and I said something to the effect of, it's like, because all of us are too racist to allow that to happen. And somebody who was formerly of NPR, so was like shocked and aghast that, that would be why. It's like, no, surely it's like a pipeline thing. I'm like, no, there are tons of highly qualified, incredibly talented people who never even make it to the point of consideration. Or if they make it to the point of consideration, we do a really good job of like weeding them out super early on. And then the ones who do survive sort of are constantly deciding between like how miserable do they want to be for whatever reasons on a daily basis. And it hasn't gotten better in the pandemic, but I think what's happened is a lot of people are giving themselves a pass and forgetting that we have this conversation every 4 or 5 years, right? Like in 2010, I think it was Liz Spade was writing a New York Times, a public editor piece about like, yes, the Times politics desk is insufficiently diverse. And it's like, okay, so 10 years later, we're having this exact same conversation again. And it's a hamster wheel, and it's very unhelpful.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So let's turn to the election. There's a big one coming. And I mean, I don't know if you saw Ben Smith's column the other day in the New York Times, basically saying newsrooms can't really grapple with anything other than a traditional election night body of coverage. Yep. But how are we going to prepare our audiences for the fact that there's probably not going to be an answer for weeks, if not months? How do we change that ritual of 7 p.m. saying this is the answer? Like, what are your thoughts more generally, but also specifically at the Texas Tribune? Do you have coverage plans?
Oh yeah, we definitely have coverage plans. We just went through this with the runoffs in Texas, and going into this, I think it's not even our audience expectations; it's our own muscles. It's, you say you like newsroom plus election equal pizza equal late night equal ticking needle things, and those reflexes are very, very strong, and we've like developed them over years, and like multiple different kinds of elections and different races, and it's very hard, as you know, to change the way that newsrooms understand what their responsibilities are for predictable recurring news moments. This is how we cover breaking news, this is how we cover X, this is how we do Y. And political coverage has become so reflexive that I don't even know if we are aware of the extent to which we are part of the problem in having conditioned generations of people in our audience to believe that you can just call something and that is definitive and declarative and not subject to debates, even though, we all went through, well, not all of us, some of us are younger, went through hanging chads at one point. And I think that Ben was very correct in identifying that we have a responsibility to not suggest, whether in our personal irascible tweeting capacities or in our news stories, that not being able to count something by 7 p.m. is a failure of the democratic process, that we have a responsibility to explain and to help people understand why it's different this time, because it in fact is different this time, whether it's because of the move to more states allowing mail-in ballots, whether it's because you can expect polling time, like, you know, time spent at polling stations to be longer if you're trying to do social distancing and all of these things, because there are fewer poll workers, because many of them come from, you know, vulnerable demographics as it relates to coronavirus. In Texas, for example, we've written a couple of stories. Alexa Ura, who's one of our demographics reporter, wrote on the fact that, you know, the mask order in Texas sort of exempts people going to polling stations, and that's had a kind of a knock-on effect to the people who are willing to show up to work those polls. And so we have got to figure out, if we don't get the tidy headline, if we don't get the certainty that all of us love, like, how are we going to make it clear in our coverage that that's okay, and that it's not nefarious, and it's like the app not working or whatever the thing is not because of, you know, nefarious state actor, but it's because what we were used to doesn't work anymore. And we're still figuring out what November is going to be like, and it's not going to be perfect, but that doesn't mean democracy is in question as a result of these things.
Yeah, and if you haven't just read, we were just talking about this before we went live, but the new piece by Ryan Mack and Craig Silverman, basically saying, you know, internally, Facebook employees asking Mark Zuckerberg, what are you going to do if President Trump basically denies the results of the election on our platform? What are you going to do? And I mean, there should have been scenario planning for months and months and months, both in newsrooms and the platforms. But, you know, I keep hearing people saying, well, you know, we just need to get through to election day. And I'm like, you know, the 36 days, I think, are going to look like, you know, cute in comparison. I could be wrong. But the news media ecosystem and just the information ecosystem looks very different to the way that it did in 2000.
Yeah, I don't think we are prepared as an industry, right? And you see this, it's because we don't understand power and we're not comfortable with it. And when I am most frustrated, kind of like with us as an industry and with certain actors in particular, it's because we act as if norms that have been flouted will somehow not be flouted the next time, right? Or that if it is that there was an understanding in place that this is how you appoint the postmaster general, or, you know, you don't sort of fire your inspectors general in the middle of the night because they disagreed with you, or your attorney general is not the personal counsel for the president. They're sort of, you know, the representative of X, Y, and Z. So we see norm erosion and erasure, but we hold on to a notion of, but the ones in November, those are totally fine. Like, everyone's gonna uphold those. When I'm like, but why? Like, what about the previous sets of years is suggesting that what we can rely on is precedent, tradition, and norms, right? And so if as a newsroom, we are ourselves reporting on the flouting of generally agreed conventions, then why are we allowing our forward-looking reporting to take for granted that those generally agreed conventions will somehow still be in place? And it's that, to me, is, you know, to your point about the BBC, I think there's a difference between trying to predict or, you know, biasing the audience in one way or another, and kind of helping people work through based on very recent precedent. And we'll call it weird things. It's like, this is a news analysis, this is opinion. Whereas in the UK, you know, the classic lead is, which will surely mean that, you know, it's like X happened and this is how people are going to feel about it and respond. And US media is just like super uncomfortable with the idea of even breadcrumbing for its audience, like how to think things through in the future.
Yeah, actually, that makes me think, because, you know, both of us have spent time on either side of the pond. But I think in Europe, there's much, because there's a strong public service media, this idea that part of my role is to educate the audience. Like the BBC is entertain, educate, and what's the last one? somebody might take away my passport. But in the US, when you sort of talk to US journalists about, you know, how do you feel this is going to help the audience? And people are like, oh, no, I'm holding truth to power. I don't, you know, it's almost like I don't care. And of course, that was for a long time at journalism conferences. People are like, where's the audience? I think we're getting a little bit better there. But yeah, do you think there's that difference?
I definitely do. And I also think the reason that, you know, solutions journalism as a frame exists is because it's the only way that some people feel comfortable with that idea of helping, right? That we have to have a label and it has to be a separate thing. And if you give somebody a link to register to vote, if you don't want to be considered an activist, be like, this is an explainer. And, you know, it's like we go through all of these fascinating mental contortions to avoid appearing to be useful, which I find just really interesting.
I love that so much. Yeah, I'd never thought about that, but you're absolutely right. The explainer piece, which is, I couldn't possibly, because that's advocacy. Yeah, let's just do 2 minutes on that. Like that whole like journalism versus advocacy. How do you feel about that?
Just similar to the conversation about objectivity. I have been on the other side of conversations where some, you know, going back a few years, you know, BuzzFeed was very early as a media organization to have an LGBT beat that was serious and rigorous and excellent and didn't pander, wasn't, you know, overly esoteric, but also wasn't trying to like gay-splain, which is a phrase that you might have heard. And we covered, and you know, shout out to, you know, Chris Geidner, who was just the person who really understood the Supreme Court in ways that many of his peers did not, and has a legal background. But we took that story seriously from the beginning, and we treated, you know, same-sex marriage in the US as with the same, I felt like the same degree of seriousness that we treated other like big conversations. And it wasn't framed as a rights justice-y thing. It was like, this is what's happening, this is what people need to know, and these are the people who are affected by this, or maybe affected by this decision. And I think a lot about the work of Patrick Strudwick, who was at BuzzFeed UK, who so much of his reporting was, one, like he's an incredible reporter and writer, but two, he always took the subjects of his journalism very seriously and treated them with a great deal of empathy, right? So no matter what he was writing about, whether it was, you know, how dating apps will allow drug dealers on the platform, even when they pull people off the platform who help people who might be overdosing, or, you know, kind of like a softer story, as we sometimes like to call it. He wrote about conversion therapy, and in a way that I thought was an absolutely stunning example of how you are completely true to every possible journalistic principle, but also make it really, really clear that this is not okay, right? And that like what folks are going through and how they are suffering and the discrimination that they are facing and the challenges that they are up against are not, is like, even if you are a person, you cannot help but be moved by this. And so I've always thought about activism, if there is a difference between activism and journalism, is that good journalism helps you understand the messiness, and activism tells a tidier story, right? And is like less willing to grapple with, not everyone is a caricature of a hero or a villain, which is not to say that journalism doesn't have those same instincts, but that good reporting is more comfortable with the nuances, that people can be complicated, that stories can be less clear cut, and that like that's part of our responsibility, is to like go into those details and help people understand that a little bit better.
Yeah. Can I just point out to everybody that Stacy-Marie is not reading off a script. I just like, if somebody just like put a microphone to you, we could just have transcribed that into an amazing article. But yeah, thank you.
I'll listen to this recording later and I'll try to retweet it out.
Oh, it's really excellent. Anyway, I promised that we would go to questions. So again, reminder, please put questions into the Q&A if you're on Zoom. If you're on the live stream, just tweet it at First Draft News and I'll get it magically. But this is a question actually from one of our amazing local news fellows who, she said this earlier when you were talking about the work-life balance thing. And she says, you know, as a freelancer, this is something I'm really struggling with, this expectation that freelancers already work from home and therefore should have no problem to continue through the pandemic in the exact same manner. How would you suggest that freelancers convey their own mental health struggles through this in a way that doesn't tarnish their reputation?
I think it's already unfair that people with less power are put into positions where they have to do this advocacy for themselves. And the media is not great at how we treat freelancers, right? If you just look at getting paid and, you know, that we try to make, like, say that 90-day terms are totally fine, as if you didn't have to pay rent 3 times between when you file the story and when you get the check. And so I definitely encourage people to, if there is a supportive editor, if there is somebody on staff who you have a good relationship with, to like have this conversation with them and say, hey, how are you all dealing with this? What are your expectations? It would be really helpful if you could, in the meetings that y'all are having about how y'all are doing this for staff, for someone to put their hand up and say, hey, how are we thinking about freelancers, right? Like there has been a few years now of unions in digital media. And I think one of the more interesting parts of that platform, of those platforms, has been representing for freelancers who are not in the room, who are not parts of the union, when advocating things like terms and safety and all of these kinds of things. And because really the power resides with the folks on staff. And so I think the responsibility resides with the folks on staff to like be an advocate on your behalf.
Yeah, and I think just having more honest conversations where we're honest about mental health, we talk about it, but no, ultimately this is about power as well. This is a question that says, worst case scenario, let's say bad actors do hack voting machines or people do throw away mail-in ballots on purpose. Would you worry about having run pre-election coverage explaining that broken machines don't necessarily mean hacking or ballots taking long to count?
No, because then you get, we said they don't necessarily, right? I mean, but this is like part of the responsibility of channeling uncertainty. I'll give an example of a story that we wrote. I'm very bad at dates. And actually, I'm just going to self-correct. I said that Spade wrote that column in 2010. It was 2016. But we...
Just feels like that.
Yeah, we wrote a story about coronavirus data in Texas, right? And there have been many, many stories across all of the different states about the challenges of understanding who's being tested, how long are those tests taken, like what deaths are being counted, are there undercounts? And the headline on this story, kid you not, probably took us like half an hour and 5 people to get to a place where we felt we weren't being inflammatory, we weren't being misleading, and we weren't going to make it really easy to weaponize this story for the people who have a vested interest in saying like, look, I told you, you can't trust anything. So we came up with why Texas's coronavirus data comes with caveats. Annals of headlines, it's not like the best thing you've ever read, but it's super clear. And it allows for the possibility of uncertainty. And I think that many, many journalists, and frankly, most editors, are extremely uncomfortable with not answering every question that we pose. And part of the major challenge of this moment is you should have more questions than answers. And you should also be questioning the answers to the questions that you're getting. Because what we know is we've just gone through a few months where it's been like masks only if you're sick, only N95s, no everyone, not necessarily N95s. What about cloth masks? And we're seeing this with voting, right? We're seeing the president of the United States going from all mail-in voting is bad to, oh no, it's the absentee one that's bad, to like, well, actually the absentee voting is fine in these specific states, but the mail-in stuff, that's still really bad. And like Nevada especially, you shouldn't trust them. And so, you know, misinformation, disinformation thrives on deliberate uncertainty. And I think our response as an industry to that has been like to overcorrect and just be like so careful and so cautious and not say anything that we have to caveat, that we are leaving room for people who, whenever they encounter uncertainty, they're only encountering it in like bad faith kind of ways, right? Because we haven't taught people that sometimes we just don't know. And that's okay, right? Sometimes public health officials don't know. They're trying to figure this out. Sometimes, you know, and I think Fauci has like done a pretty good job of modeling this, information changes. The thing that you find out at the beginning of the FDA trial versus 2 weeks in versus a year in is going to be really different. And that doesn't mean the thing that happened in the beginning was a conspiracy, or it was false, or it was bad, or it was misleading. It just meant like that's the process that you have to go through to arrive at something that feels more certain. But that, I think, still feels really uncomfortable for a lot of us.
Yeah, actually, at the beginning of this, I was on a webinar with Joe Smizer from the Public Good Project, and he's a public health communication expert. And he said exactly that, which is we should have modeled our messaging like a fire chief during a wildfire that says, right now, the fire is right in front of me. Tomorrow, it could be there, 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 there. I don't know where. Follow along, and I will give you information as soon as I have it. But no, it could change at any minute. And because of that certainty, it's why we're in the mess that we're in. And I think also journalists have often failed to explain how the sausage is made. Well, it turns out I'm also a researcher. You know, researchers have been terrible at explaining how the sausage is made. And so the mixture, you put those two things together, it's a terrible sausage.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? And like, I have this conversation with my own teams, and I've had this conversation with my teams at different places, which is sometimes the thing to say is what we don't know. And I remember one of the major innovations of BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed News specifically, when we were covering breaking news, is, you know, and shout out to Lisa Tozzi, who was the news director at the time. When there was a fast moving breaking news story, it was like a terrorist attack, a school shooting, we would put up bullet points, and it would say something like what we know, like, right? Like, this is what we know. And sometimes it would be like, and this is what we don't know. Like, we don't know who these people are. And everyone was like aghast. Like, one, how dare you use bullet points in a serious news story? And two, why are you saying that you haven't confirmed these things? And it's because you have to help people understand that you are asking those questions, and that not having it immediately doesn't mean you're not trying to get it. Or in fact, sometimes it doesn't mean that you are trying to get it, but like, this is the state of the world. And so, you know, we enjoy being perceived as people with the answers. And I really wish we were equally as comfortable being perceived as people with good questions.
I love that. And it reminds me, actually, there was a Texas Tegna affiliate who did this during a shooting, that they put the screen in thirds. It was on TV, and it was like, this is what we absolutely know is true. Mm-hmm. This is what we know is absolutely false because of all the rumors. And the middle was like, and this is what we're working on. And the same thing, there were other journalists who were like, and they did all this audience testing, and the audience couldn't get enough of it. They're like, why haven't you guys been doing this from the very beginning? And I have to ask this. I actually told Stacy-Marie I was going to say this, but one of the reasons I love Stacy-Marie is if you don't follow her on Twitter, S_M_I, you will not have a better Twitter account to follow. But also, when Stacy-Marie has got an issue with journalists, she calls it. And one of your biggest pet peeves is when journalists just retweet rumors, either with like or photos because they haven't checked, and you have no tolerance for that.
None whatsoever.
Like, how do we stop this? Because it's 2020 and it's still happening.
Well,
Stacey has some thoughts.
I have some thoughts. I think one of the biggest things is there has to be professional consequences for getting things wrong. And we have to, among my controversial perspectives, is we have to treat social with the same rigor that we treat what we publish on our website, what we put in a newsletter. And I don't care if you're tweeting about cats or dogs or ice cream. I care that if we work in an industry in which the most baseline thing we can do is confirm that something is the thing that we are saying it is. And I think that if you are serious about, you know, showing up for work or just like being a person who works in the news, it shouldn't matter what context you're in, right? I am not going to WhatsApp my siblings unverified speculation because they're my siblings and it's a social platform. Like, it's just like, no, that part of my brain never shuts up, which is a problem for probably a therapist. But you know, we have treated, and I think it's because of like the condescension that we've often had about like people on the internet, where we treat the stakes as if they're less, when it's not something that is, you know, like our personal byline. Like, I treat my social media accounts as if they're part of my byline, which is to say, if I said it, I will own it. And, you know, you might not agree with what I'm saying, you might have concerns about what I'm saying, but I'm like, it's my name, and I have a responsibility, and I'm going to show up so that when you like Google my name, this is, this is the totality of the thing, which is not to say I don't also delete my tweets, but so I treat social platforms, I treat group texts, I treat like one-on-one communications with like that same sense of skepticism. And I do this to my family, right? Like my mom will send me a forward and I'll be like, Mom, we talked about
this.
We've talked about this. I've trained various of my friends, like they'll send me a message on Signal and be like, I was going to share this thing. And then I thought about it and I didn't. And I'm like, #impact.
Yeah.
But I think that newsrooms need to do a better job of normalizing to everybody on staff, whether they are journalists or engineers, that the professional standards in which we operate, especially as it relates to not needlessly stoking rumor and speculation, like don't turn off, right? And, I think about this, like medical professionals who are off the clock aren't gonna not save someone's life because they're having a sandwich. And I feel like we can't not check something because it's a Saturday at 2 p.m. So.
Yeah, and I have to say, we've just been going through some recruitment processes, and when you start looking through people's Twitter accounts, and I'm just like, I thought we taught this back in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
Like a part of it, it's just the kind of flippancy, it's the not checking, it's, I think, feeling like they're part of this journalism club.
Yeah.
But, like what? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I also, this is definitely a tweet that I deleted because it was a long time ago. Having worked in a tech company, I know exactly how many people are trying to make it easy for you to not think about retweeting a thing. Right? There's universes of very talented, very well paid designers and product managers and user experience managers and researchers who are like, but if you make the button this color, more people will press it and not think about it. And so we are paid to be extra skeptical. And whereas most people aren't, like it is not the responsibility of most people to be thinking about how they're being manipulated on a daily basis. That's our job, right? It's like, why is the lying bastard lying to me? It's like, why is the product manager trying to get me to click this button? It's like, it's the same. They
have a huge bonus coming their way.
Exactly. So, and I really want to normalize the perspective among journalists that what we say in every platform, we should just take half a second to try to check.
Yeah, but I feel like we could be having this conversation in 10 years. I think you're right. Unless there are professional repercussions, I just am surprised that we're at the point we are now. And I'm still surprised that we're not training this stuff in journalism schools. Yeah. I'm annoyed that this hasn't become the norm. But anyway, right, it is top of the hour and you probably still have some more Zoom calls to do.
I'm going to try I'm just going to go voice only.
But I just have to say, I knew you would be great. I just love this more than I expected to. I think you are astonishing. I'm so pleased that you are doing what you're doing at the Texas Tribune. If people haven't subscribed, please subscribe or at least check it out. Follow Stacy-Marie on Twitter. You will not regret it. But don't retweet anything that is not correct because she will call you out on it. And because it's the end of Infotheque, which I know looked like
congratulations.
Thank you. It seems like a small virtual event, but I just want to say the whole team have been amazing, particularly Nell and Marissa, our event staff, who I've got no idea how anybody signs up to be a wedding planner or event staff. They have made everything look so smooth. But I would like to thank everybody. Just to say, the conversations, I have to say, have been extraordinary from so many of our speakers. Also, what Stacy-Marie was talking about polling, there was an excellent panel yesterday with Jessica Huseman and Tammy Patrick talking about these things. We will be editing all the videos, making them available. So if you weren't able to catch everything, the great thing about Zoom is you didn't miss it and you can see it another time. But thank you very much to Stacy-Marie. Thank you to my whole team. You're amazing. I'm very sad that we're not all together now to go down to the bar to have a gin and tonic, but maybe one day. But
one day.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.